Hi there, and welcome to this week's Art of Procurement podcast, powered by SIG. And this week's episode is actually for listeners or for members of your team who may be relatively new to the procurement profession, or maybe for those organizations who are at the early stages of their procurement journey. And my guest is Joseph Richardson. So Joseph is the president and the CEO of Professional Purchasing Partners, which he founded in 2014. Joseph was actually a practitioner before then. He had a long spell as a practitioner, with his most recent buy-side role being as a head of indirect procurement in the oil and gas industry. And so in our discussion, we really touch on a wide range of topics. We go from the evolution of procurement to the fit of procurement within an organization. We talk about value beyond savings, and we go into a bunch of other things as well. But one of the things that really resonated with me is when we talked about the notion of best-in-class procurement and also benchmarking our organizations against others. Well, when we recorded the episode, it was actually back in September of last year. It was at ProcureCon, at their Indirect West conference, and we recorded while we were sat on the back patio of the hotel lobby. So there may be some background noise. Hopefully it's not particularly distracting. And so in the interview, the first question I actually asked Joseph, like I often do, is whether he picked procurement or whether procurement picked him.
That's a very interesting question. My career started out in contracts management. On the defense industry side. So I learned a lot about the intricacies of contract management, contract writing, and contract terms and conditions interpretation.
Yeah.
At that time, the strongest function in the organization was contracts.
Right.
Purchasing was not really thought well of at the time. Because it was just the execution of orders that were generated by another department. So I began in contract administration. And from that point on, as I proceeded in my career, I took over in a contract fashion. I took over the contract responsibility for Digital Equipment Corporation.
Right.
And so being there for a period of time, I was told that everybody who's anybody had to go into manufacturing.
Yeah.
And so I left the contracts group and I went into the manufacturing facility in Springfield, Massachusetts. And so at that point, I was responsible for purchasing, planning, inventory control, as well as supplier quality engineering. So I had and stores,
right.
And so I had the entire gamut, and so I had to learn on the fly how to be a good purchasing manager, responsible for the functions that I just described.
Yeah, as you've seen the function mature, over your career, have we? Well, there's a couple of things actually I wanted to ask. One, which was really interesting, we were talking about this before we actually hit the record button, is what is procurement? What do you actually think procurement is? And I've got a follow-up I'd love to ask. But
well, if you ask 5 people to define procurement, you'll get 25 answers.
Yeah.
So this is my definition of procurement, which is the acquisition of goods and services to support your business line. So procurement has a dual responsibility. One is in the direct area, and that is the acquisition of goods and services that go into the product that you're manufacturing for customers. And then there's the indirect procurement. And while it does not go into the product itself, you need it to run a business, like computers, software, finance support, that's accounts payable. It's also hotels and consulting acquisition and legal services, all of those things, facilities, utilities, all of those things are in the indirect area.
Right. We talked a little bit about whether we think about procurement as a function, but is it really a function, or is it just an activity that we as procurement professionals have kind of, built ourselves around a function? We think that a function of procurement exists today and it always has to exist in the future, but is that really the case, or are we just enabling a transaction, if you will?
Well, it's both. When you look at procurement, you ask the question, is it a function, is it a process, is it a strategy, is it a practice? It's all of those things. And so unfortunately not all organizations really view it that way. They view it particularly as a function, a function that is to provide cost savings. And so when you do mention the purchasing organization, that's kind of a colloquial term. It's a metaphor for a lot of things. Now, there has been a change in understanding of the difference between procurement and sourcing. So the procurement part of it is the actual acquisition of the goods and services, and the sourcing would identify the sources from which the goods and services would come from.
Yeah, as you've seen the procurement function mature and the role of the CPO, I think, mature, have we, in your kind of experience, fulfilled the promise, or have we still got a long way to go? A lot of work to do. Are we on the right track?
Well, there was a big push on making sure that the head of the sourcing procurement organization had a C-suite position. That position being equivalent in power and structure to the CFO or COO.
Yeah.
In many instances, that's not the case. It is a title in title only, but it doesn't really translate to being a C-suite position.
Like the chief role in other areas of the organization.
Right, and I think the fallacy here, in my opinion, is that regardless of what you call it, whether it's the chief or the head of procurement, it still has that P stigma.
Yeah.
And that P stigma is associated with purchasing and procurement. And so I don't know how to get away from that. However, I think the person who is functionally responsible for that entity has to be a higher level.
Right.
Because the chief procurement officer touches every element of the company. It touches HR because they populate all of the resources for the company. It touches engineering because they design the product. It designs it aligns with accounts payable, with quality, with manufacturing. All of the elements of the company is really influenced or touched by the procurement organization. So in order for that to take place, I think that there should be a merger between the functional requirements of the CPO and the functional requirements for the chief operating officer. Now you're talking seriously about a C-suite position.
Right. So it's more operations and procurement.
Yes.
Within that function, not necessarily aligning with finance, which I think traditionally at least we've done in most organizations.
They didn't know where to put procurement.
Yeah.
So even the chief procurement officer, in many instances, reports to someone else who reports to the chief executive officer.
Yeah, it's still layered. And some of that, I think, is down to that notion of procurement exists to save money, as opposed to a lot of the other things that maybe that's how we've been measured and continue to be measured, but that's not necessarily our true value proposition. There's far more that we can do than that. You actually moderated, we're here at ProcureCon, you moderated a panel. One of the, I think, key tenets of that panel was how do we go beyond savings? How do we bring value to our organizations in ways that are beyond, negotiating a 3 or the 5 or the 10% cost reduction, whatever that may be. I'd like to know a little bit, or ask for your perspective on how we do that. But before I go there, how do we actually define value? Because value can mean so many different things to different people.
Value is, and you're absolutely correct, value is a relative term.
Yeah.
And so what I believe to be value to me may not be a value to you. So it depends on whether or not it's fit for purpose, what my responsibilities are, what my deliverables are, and your contribution to ensure the integrity of my deliverables, that would be valuable to me.
Yeah.
Now that goes far beyond just saving 10% on some goods that I may acquire from another source. So the value that procurement could provide has to do with developing a relationship with the stakeholders. And those internal relationships so that you can understand what the stakeholder requirements are.
Yeah.
Now, the stakeholders, and you have many of them, you would have to rank them in terms of ranking of importance, areas of importance to the organization. you don't want to spend a lot of time with a stakeholder that represents about 2% of the revenue to the company. Now, but I will say that function is important.
Yeah.
So we would give them some service, but certainly not to the extent that we would with another stakeholder that's contributing, let's say 70 or 65 or 70%.
Or you'd want to think about the materiality of that to the business. I think that's the other kind of dynamic, isn't it? That maybe there's a lower spend, but it's the area of the business, it's the growth area of the business, or this area is going to contribute to whatever the objective or the vision of the company is. So that may be a way that, you know what, we should focus a little bit more on that area, even though the dollars aren't there. But it's kind of looking at big picture. You know.
Absolutely. That is the other part of it, where it may not be 40 or 50 or 60% of the revenue of the company, but as you point out, it could be an emerging technology.
Right.
And that is probably something that we need to invest in, we need to provide resources for, so that would provide the growth and development for the future of the company. So there are three areas. There's the emerging technology and emerging products. Then there's the steady state, which is the stuff that's already in production and going along pretty well. Then there's the end of life parts that you would acquire. Now, all three are important for different reasons. You don't want to spend a lot of time with the end of life stuff, but these are your spares and repairs.
Yep.
And so because you still need them, you have to develop and maintain relationships with the suppliers that furnish those things. Right. And you want to tie in future business with the spare and repairs.
Yeah.
And if they don't support that product line as a continuum, because we have customers as well that have expectations, then they may not fall in favor for other business opportunities that would happen in the future.
Yeah, it's kind of taking a big picture perspective of that supplier relationship.
Yes, that's the carrot.
And in indirects, it's looking at what are the products or services that you're buying that you will always need. Those things that again they're kind of churning over in terms of spend and the usage of them from the year-on-year perspective. But where is innovation? Where's innovation occurring? And kind of focusing on some of those areas where you think you can innovate either from a service or even in your own business models.
Let's take IT, for example, which is an indirect category. Before the procurement organization started to focus on indirect procurement, IT still had a fiduciary and a functional responsibility to provide the technology to support the various businesses. And we do have, of course, ERP systems, and the IT department was responsible for actually acquiring the goods and services to support these product lines. So at the beginning of the year, all of these departments within the enterprise, they have budgets. And so a part of that budget is what contributions they're going to need to support their IT requirements. So IT, again, this is before indirect procurement emerged, IT would have to go out and have to buy these products and services. And so moving forward in time, you have procurement now saying, we have emerged, it is our responsibility. We will take over the responsibility for acquiring these goods and services. So immediately you have a conflict because IT is still being held responsible for delivering. And so they've already established a certain group of suppliers that they want to use, and now sourcing and procurement is saying, hey, look, they're not sufficient. So the question is, how do you really merge these two entities together? And so that is part of the relationship building that I think is so important. As an example, when I was responsible for indirect procurement at my previous company, I wanted to establish one manufacturer of computers, laptops, desktops, servers, workstations. I wanted to do it with one company. Now, we didn't buy that much in terms of, a volume from these different OEMs, but we were the number one company in our field. So how I pictured that is that, hey, if we're number one in our field and we have selected a particular supplier of computers to represent all of our IT requirements, then that must mean something or would mean something to that company.
Right.
And so it did. I won't mention the name of the company that we selected, but I had buy-in by the chief information officer and the directors of the different businesses across the globe. Now, it took a lot of work and a lot of presentations on my part. And by the way, I took them gifts when I visited with them so I could establish a relationship with them. Whether it was, alcohol or wine or I know this one guy, he loves single malt scotch. I would take a nice bottle of single malt scotch, and I would take them out to dinner. I would give presentations to the departments. So it was all about establishing the relationships. Yeah. As a result of that, we were able to standardize all of our workstations, the servers, our desktop, laptop. Now there was an exception, because some of the engineering in the engineering community, they needed special computers.
Right.
So that only represented about 5% of the buy. So I allowed for engineering to go out and buy the various
but you don't want to
laptops.
restrain what they need.
No, because they needed to develop their algorithms and to move forward with these very sophisticated mathematical models. And so, but the rest of the company, we standardized on everything, and we rolled them out. Some we leased, some we bought outright, depending on the financial structure of the departments. But that is really providing value to the stakeholder at that point. So now, the IT department, of course, would have more faith in my ability because I delivered exactly what I said I was going to deliver.
Yeah. And you brought them all to kind of around a common goal.
Yes.
So is it ultimately, where it may have been your vision to begin with, you influenced them to a point where they saw why this should be a common goal, and then everybody kind of came around and wanted to be a kind of, a part of that. They saw why you were doing it, and you weren't doing it because this is something procurement wanted. It's something that was best for the business, and they all kind of agreed that was the best way for the business.
Yes. So if I only focused on cost savings and not functional integration, then everybody would have gone out. One would buy Lenovo, other would buy HP, somebody else would buy Dell, and there was no leveraging.
Yeah.
And that certainly was very important.
Yeah.
Now, I use that, I'm sorry for interrupting,
No,
I use that same philosophy and that same methodology in standardizing office supplies across the company worldwide.
Yeah.
So it was developing the relationships. I used the same kind of tactics and implementing strategies for the success of those programs
bringing
as well.
everybody on the journey together. We talked in the session, in the session that you facilitated, there was a discussion around when we're trying to build relationships with new stakeholders, and kind of the balancing act between we only have so much resource, and the fact that when building relationships with new stakeholders, you often have to start really small and do projects that maybe you wouldn't ordinarily want or have the bandwidth to do. In your opinion, when does it make sense for us to actually focus on those really small projects versus just saying, hey, we have a self-sourcing process, here's a bunch of steps you can go and do it on yourself, versus bringing that white glove treatment, but to something that may only be a 20 grand project or a 30 grand project?
Well, you would have to assess the value of that project and the growth potential of that project. So if it's something that's just an R&D project that may or may not have any significance, then I would say yes, we would identify a sourcing process to allow for them to go through that process to acquire what they're looking for.
Yeah.
In those particular areas, we would want to provide protection for intellectual capital and making sure that the company is protected in that regard. So as long as the procurement organization is able to provide that guidance and direction, that's not a hands-on everyday requirement. Maybe check on them once or twice a week to see how they're progressing.
Yep.
I think that would provide some support for those areas that are in the research and development mode. But you would have to look at the potential of those projects. Some of them have had great potential, and we would probably want to give them more resources to support it.
Yeah.
And if I didn't have the resource, then of course I would collaborate with the stakeholder to see whether or not they would be interested in partially funding
Right.
a resource dedicated for that. And that way everybody wins.
Yeah. And also I think when you think about potential, it's the potential of that stakeholder as opposed to are they managing or spending other money that it would be that we want to be able to help them, spending, I don't want to say a better job because that's presumptuous, but at least help them put in place structure around how they spend that money. And if there's something behind it, then maybe this is a smaller project, but it's actually worth it to build the relationship so then you can start going into larger and larger and larger projects down the line.
An evolutionary process,
Right.
yes. And so, yes, you're absolutely correct. Sometimes you would want to put that infrastructure in place if there was clear and convincing evidence to support that this is a very strong growth opportunity. And if it's consistent with the technological development of the company in terms of the direction, from a technical point of view, that the company is going, yeah, absolutely. It may be worth the investment
Right.
to support that function. But, it's really kind of interesting because some of the stakeholders, they believe that the budget that they have is their money. And they want to spend their money
Right.
in accordance with what they believe there needs to be.
Yeah.
And
It's like
so-
they're spending money.
Yes.
when you're giving it as a child, here's your
an
spending
allowance.
money, your allowance. Yeah, go and spend it.
Yes, but the truth of the matter is that it's not their money. It's the company's money. And the sourcing and procurement organization, supply chain organization, has the fiduciary responsibility to make sure that that money is spent appropriately. So while we're not saying don't spend it in a particular area, we're saying let's spend it in an area that does make sense.
Yeah.
So the work should determine, what the end product would be. It's not just that I want a Rolls Royce so I can get to the airport on
Right.
time.
Yep.
If you're looking for a transportation vehicle, then a Pinto would get you there in
Yep.
time. So you don't need that additional luxury if you're only looking for a basic transportation
Yes,
car.
kind of working with stakeholders to separate needs from the wants.
Absolutely.
And how they may differ. And also, I think, thinking about outcomes rather than the mode. So, using the example you gave there to get to the airport, well, maybe what they need isn't actually buying a vehicle in the first place. It's actually going and getting an Uber or a Lyft or something else like that. It still gets them the same outcome, but it's a different way of thinking about how you're going to get that outcome.
Absolutely. Now, having said that, I want you to also understand that many organizations are still, their financial model is very archaic. So you get, let's say, $1 million for supporting your department. And that's for the current work, for your infrastructure, and for the acquisition of goods and services that you need in order to move forward. So you have $1 million. So at the end of the year, if you only spend $900,000, then the following year they reduce it by
Right.
$100,000. So you're not incentivized by saving the company money.
Right.
And so somehow the metrics must reflect the intent, the spirit and the intent of what the company is trying to do. And some of these archaic processes and policies and procedures need to be revised so that it's more of an incentive for the stakeholders to go out and save money, because then they're able to use that money in the next phase or
Yeah.
next budget
Yeah.
for something else.
Right.
Now, you may get 50% of that cost savings, but you get 50% back as well.
Yes.
So rather than losing 100,000, you only lose 50,000, but you are encouraged to go out and do, what
Because
you
you're not
need to do.
incented necessarily to want to cut your budget, so to find new ways of buying.
Yes.
If the money is going to be taken away from you, and you believe, for whatever reason, that you need to invest that money next year because of, perhaps how a project is evolving or whatever it may be. But you
Sure.
don't want to lose access to that the year after.
Right, exactly.
I just want to touch on a couple of last things, and this is more, again, from the session that you facilitated yesterday. We talked a little bit about organizations early on in their journey. The first question that I had related to that, it's something I've got an opinion on as well, but when you start a journey, a lot of organizations say, I want to be best in class. I have a vision to be best in class procurement, and they'll go and read what best in class looks like, or they'll have been told what best in class looks like. There may be some white paper or some research firm. Is best in class really a fallacy? Are we kind of chasing the wrong thing?
Well, is it a fallacy? Is it a metaphor? And it may be a little bit of both. People will use a colloquialism that says, hey, I want to be best in class. And the question is, as you point out, what does that really mean?
Right.
And was that best in class is applicable to your area, your class?
Yeah.
You can't take what worked well for Motorola and then say, hey, it worked, they were best in class, and it was written up, as a best practice, so therefore I'm going to take this and plug it into my organization.
Don't benchmark yourself against something you may even think are your peers, but a completely different scenario or situation around it.
Correct. So there are 6 elements that I look at: people, process, technology, technical, political, and cultural. So Motorola or IBM or any of the other big manufacturing companies in the high-tech area, they have a particular infrastructure. They have a particular culture. They have a particular political system.
Yeah.
Their people are different.
Yeah.
Their processes are different. So you can't just take what worked for them and play it in your organization. So I personally, I don't want to be best in class. I just want to be good at what I do.
Right.
And so what I want to do is make sure that I understand the dynamics of my company.
Yeah.
What will work and what won't work. And so I have to take into consideration those 6 elements as I go through that evaluation process.
I couldn't agree with you more. I see organizations who are on a journey to be best in class, and that best in class may not work for them. And, best in class is so dependent on your own organization. And I've said this in other shows actually that I've done. You can be a 1 or a 2. Why try and get to a 10 when you really need to get to a 3 or a 4? Evolve, see where you are, see where your organization is in terms of what your organization needs from a procurement function, and then build kind of your journey around what the needs, rather than building something that maybe the gold-plated version company doesn't even need it.
Let me give you a case in point. I worked for a computer manufacturer, and it was number 1 in their market. And so one of the issues they had these contacts that were platinum contacts, and then they gold-plated them.
Right.
Why would anyone gold-plate a platinum contact?
Right.
It's an extra step that's unnecessary, and you're using that precious metal to do it. But design engineers, sometimes they want to make sure that when you see something, you think of them.
Yeah.
They want something that's unique.
It's part of the brand as opposed to part of the manufacturing,
yes.
like the efficacy of the product.
Exactly. And so what happened was that company, and I talked with design engineering, and design engineering would make products that couldn't be manufactured. So what they would do is throw the design over the wall to manufacturing engineering and say, okay, build this. Manufacturing engineering would look at it and start laughing and say, it's impossible to build this in a manufacturing environment. So they would have to use like maybe 10 or 12 engineering change notices to get it to the point of manufacturability.
Right.
So what I did was I got both the manufacturing engineering organization and the design engineering organization together, so that the next generation of products, it took into account the learnings from those engineering change notices, and that actually contributed to the design for manufacturing for the next generation of products.
Right. Now, makes complete sense, and as we're thinking about setting up, I'm thinking again about early stage procurement organizations. This is really my last question today, and it was something else that was covered in the session yesterday. Should we even be thinking about investing too much in maturing a procurement function if we don't have good spend data? Or should spend data be really the first thing that we do so we actually get an understanding of the lay of the land?
That is an excellent question, and spend data is just one element. So there are so many other elements to having a functionally literate organization. There's training and development of the resources that you have. You want to make sure that you have the right resources in the right positions. So education, training, and development is very important. Understanding the roles and responsibilities of that function, where it is, but not necessarily where it is today, but where it could be. And actually putting together a roadmap to allow for the organization to evolve to a particular level. Looking at spend data is a dirty job because data in and of itself doesn't mean anything to you. So it's the conversion of data to information, information to knowledge, knowledge to wisdom, and that's what you need to make good, sound business decisions. Sometimes you're only going to have 40% clarity in the data. And so you've got to go with what you have because you still have a business to operate. And so as what I have done with my organizations in the past is I had them refine the data and re-verify as they move forward. But you could not lay stagnant just because you didn't have 100% good data.
So it's not a linear approach. You're not waiting for good spend data, then you're building a capability, then you're building relationships. You're kind of doing it all concurrently, but recognizing that you really have to invest in getting actionable insights out of that data to ultimately be strategic as opposed to, I think, reactionary.
Yes.
Well, Joseph, I want to thank you very much for joining me in the baking heat. We're doing this outside here in Phoenix. The easy question is, where can listeners find you if they'd like to connect with you after the interview, if they'd like to learn a little bit more about what you do? Excellent.
Well, I don't want you to laugh at my archaic email address, but it's RICHJOS as in Sam 9 at AOL.com. My office number is area code 281. The phone number is 251-7350. My mobile number is 281-787-8726.
Great. Well, what I'll do is I'll include your contact details in the show notes for today's episode so nobody has to furiously scribble those down. Don't be ashamed about the AOL email address. I still have an AOL email address too. So at least there's two of us out there.
Yes.
But those will be at artofprocurement.com/Joseph Richardson. That's artofprocurement.com/Joseph Richardson. So thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thanks. Thank you for listening to another episode of The Art of Procurement. To find an archive of all past episodes, you can go to artofprocurement.com/episodes. And to ensure you never miss another show, go to artofprocurement.com/subscribe.